Okay, so you guys have really sent in a fascinating bunch of articles this time around.
Yeah.
Seems like everywhere you look, the headlines are screaming about
Yeah.
President Trump signing this executive order and,
Hmm.
aiming to dismantle the entire U.S. Department of Education. It's
Right.
pretty big news, obviously, and we all know how these things go, right?
Yeah.
The initial announcement, the headline, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely. I think what really jumps out with you initially is just the sheer amount of coverage this is getting. And from such a diverse range of sources. You've got CNBC, Axios Global News, MSNBC, Salon, and that's just in English.
Right, and then you've got El País France 24, The Guardian.
Exactly. And we even have some perspectives from Italy with Il Post and Il Foglio, and of course the New York Times South China Morning Post, CNET Open.
Wow, yeah, that's a truly global picture.
It really gives us a comprehensive view of this development and all the different ways people are interpreting it.
And that's precisely why we do these deep dives, right? We don't just want to skim the surface.
Exactly.
Our listeners, you guys are smart. You want to understand the real nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
We're talking about the actual mechanisms of this executive order, what it does, what are the obstacles it's going to face,
Mm.
and perhaps most importantly, what are the potential consequences for education here in the U.S.
Right.
We want to get to that point where everything just clicks.
Absolutely.
Where you have that aha moment, but without getting bogged down in the weeds.
Weed.
So let's start by grounding ourselves. What did President Trump actually sign on Thursday, March 20th, 2025?
Well, first off, that date, Thursday, March 20th, 2025, that's consistent across all these sources.
Okay, so we've got the when.
Right. And the core of the executive order itself is also very clear. Outlets like Axios France 24, The Guardian Open, they all report that the order directly instructs Education Secretary Linda McMahon to, quote, take all necessary steps to facilitate the closure of the Department of Education and return education authority to the states.
Okay, all necessary steps. That sounds pretty definitive.
Yeah.
But then I'm seeing in some of these articles, including Axios, Salon, and Open, they also talk about this aim of ensuring an uninterrupted delivery of services, programs, and benefits.
Right.
I mean, doesn't that seem a bit contradictory? Like, how do you dismantle a massive federal agency and at the same time guarantee that everything it does just keeps running smoothly?
You've hit on a really important point there. It really highlights the inherent tension at the heart of this whole thing.
Right.
The administration is trying to present this as a seamless transition.
Sure.
But when you think about the logistics of it all, dismantling a major federal department that oversees so many programs, distributes so much funding,
Yeah.
and simultaneously making sure that there's zero disruption to any of it,
It's hard to imagine.
it's incredibly complex. It does make you wonder about how realistic that uninterrupted delivery actually is in practice. And then there's another crucial detail that comes from a White House summary that Axios, El Post, and El País obtained.
Okay, what's that?
So the order also directs that any program or activity that continues to receive Department of Education funds cannot advance DEI or gender ideology.
So it's not just about shifting control back to the states.
No.
There's also a very deliberate ideological component.
Exactly.
Okay, and of course we can't forget President Trump's own words.
Right.
Global News and the New York Times quote him saying that the administration will take all lawful steps to shut down the department, quote, as quickly as possible, going beyond its, quote, core necessities.
Wow.
And Axios and The Guardian point out that he's actually expressed hope that Linda McMahon will be the last person to ever hold the position of Education Secretary.
That's pretty clear.
It really shows you how determined they are.
Yeah, it definitely paints a picture of a very deliberate effort to fundamentally change the federal government's role in education.
Which brings us to the why. What's the real motivation behind this executive order?
Well, according to a lot of the sources, including Global News and El País, Trump has a long history of being very critical of the Department of Education. He's often called it wasteful and polluted by liberal ideology.
Right. He seems to believe that individual states can just do a better job managing education.
Exactly. And if you look at the broader political context, the White House Principal Deputy Press Secretary Harrison Fields, he's quoted in Axios and Salon saying that there's a, quote, national crisis in NEP scores.
NEP scores, for those who aren't familiar, that's the National Assessment of Educational Progress.
Right, sometimes called the nation's report card.
And they're blaming this on Democrats' policies.
Right, they're saying that this executive order is all about empowering parents, states, and local communities to take control and fix this.
Okay, so this aligns perfectly with a promise Trump made during his campaign.
Absolutely.
Axios and The Guardian both mention that he pledged to reduce and ultimately eliminate federal oversight of public education.
Right, this isn't some new idea for him.
Not at all. And this isn't happening in a vacuum either.
No, it isn't.
Axios, MSNBC, The Guardian, and Il Foglio all point to the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025,
Oh, yes.
which has been very influential in shaping this administration's policies.
It has.
And they specifically recommended eliminating the Department of Education as a key part of achieving greater state control.
So it's not just a whim, it's part of a larger conservative strategy.
Precisely. And then we have Trump's own words again.
Right.
El País quotes him as saying public schools have been taken over by the lunatics of the radical left.
Oh, wow.
And that he wants to give power back to American parents to ensure what he calls a high-quality, pro-American education.
Mm-hmm.
He's also mentioned cutting funding for schools that push things like critical race theory or what he calls gender ideology.
Right.
Keeping men out of women's sports, ending the teaching of, quote, Marxism that he sees as hostile to Judeo-Christian values.
It's pretty clear that cultural anxieties are a major driving force behind this.
Absolutely. The Guardian really emphasizes that point. And the New York Times also mentions that the administration is citing poor test scores as a justification.
Yeah, although the connection between the Department of Education and those test scores is definitely debatable.
For sure. And then there's Linda McMahon.
Right, the Education Secretary?
MSNBC Salon and France 24 all report that shortly after she took office, she sent out this memo titled, Our Department's Final Mission.
Final mission, huh?
Yeah, and when Fox News asked her point blank if the country needs the Department of Education, she just said, no, we don't.
So they're really committed to this from the top down.
It seems that way, but here's the big question. Can President Trump actually abolish the Department of Education just by signing an executive order?
And this is where every single source we looked at agrees.
Yeah.
The answer is a resounding no.
No.
CNBC, Axios Global News, MSNBC, Salon France 24, The Guardian, CNET, Open Il Post, The New York Times, Il Foglio, they all make it very clear.
Wow, every single one.
Every single one. The power to eliminate a federal department, like a Department of Education, that lies solely with the U.S. Congress.
So they would need an act of Congress.
Exactly. And as many of these articles point out, that probably means getting 60 votes in the Senate to overcome a filibuster.
And that 60-vote threshold, that's the big hurdle.
It is Axios, El High, CNET Open. They all highlight the fact that Republicans currently only have a 53-47 majority in the Senate.
They're quite a ways off from that supermajority.
They are, and it's not just about the votes in Congress.
Right.
Several sources like Axios Global News, France 24 Il Post, and the South China Morning Post, they all emphasize that if the executive branch tries to sidestep Congress, there will almost certainly be legal challenges.
Makes sense.
And the South China Morning Post actually reports that a group of Democratic state attorneys general have already filed a lawsuit.
They're not wasting any time.
No, they're not. The legal arguments will likely focus on the separation of powers. You know, the idea that each branch of government has its own distinct role.
Right.
And the Constitution gives Congress the power to create and eliminate federal agencies.
So this could really drag things out.
It could create a lot of uncertainty and delay.
And what's interesting is that Global News reports even some of Trump's allies are skeptical.
Really?
Yeah, they doubt that he can actually shut down the agency without Congress getting involved.
Huh, interesting.
They even point to a vote that happened in the House back in 2023 where an amendment to close the department failed and 60 Republicans actually voted against it.
So there's not even full support within the Republican Party.
Exactly. It just goes to show you how complicated this whole thing is.
It does. So if getting rid of the Department of Education entirely requires Congress to act, what has the administration been doing in the meantime?
Well, it seems they haven't exactly been sitting on their hands.
Right.
Global News, for example, says that the administration has been actively gutting the agency.
Gutting, that's a pretty strong word.
It is. So what specific actions have they taken?
Well, one of the most widely reported actions is the massive reduction in staff.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that.
CNBC reports that the department has laid off almost half of its employees.
Wow.
The numbers have dropped from 4,133 down to 2,183.
That's a huge decrease.
It is, and other sources confirm those figures has been a major downsizing.
And remember that final mission email that Secretary McMahon sent out to the staff?
Oh, yeah. That must have been quite a signal.
MSNBC Salon and France 24 all mentioned that email. I'm sure it sent a very clear message.
Absolutely. And on top of the staff reductions, CNET reports that leases have been terminated on regional Department of Education offices in Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, and New York.
So they're physically shrinking the department's presence.
Exactly. And it's not just about personnel and office space.
What else?
Global News reports that there have been major cuts to the Office for Civil Rights and the Institute of Education Sciences.
Which is responsible for education research?
Yeah, exactly.
So this suggests they're pulling back from those areas.
Yeah, these cuts definitely signal a shift in priorities.
Right.
It could weaken the department's ability to fulfill its responsibilities, especially when it comes to things like protecting civil rights in education and supporting evidence-based practices.
And The Guardian points out that the department has been boasting about dismantling DEI programs.
DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Right, and they've stopped investigating book banning incidents.
Which reflects those ideological goals we talked about earlier.
Exactly. And then you have the case of Columbia University.
What happened there?
Well, the New York Times reports that federal officials placed Columbia's Middle Eastern Studies Department under academic receivership.
Wow.
And they canceled $400 million in grants and contracts.
That's a pretty strong statement.
It shows that even while they're trying to dismantle the agency, they're still willing to use their power to influence higher education.
It does. So with all of these actions already underway, and their stated goal of ultimately getting rid of the department,
Right.
what are the potential consequences if this continues, even if they don't get Congress to fully abolish it?
That's the big question. What could the wider impact be?
Well, there's a lot of concern from various groups.
Like who?
CNBC quotes consumer advocates who say that the potential harm is huge. They predict a weakening of public education, a failure to protect civil rights in education,
Yeah.
and they say that corporate interests will be prioritized over the right to a quality education.
That's a pretty dire prediction.
It is, and these worries are echoed by many others.
Right.
Global News calls the executive order dangerous and illegal.
Strong words.
They say would disproportionately hurt low-income students, students of color, and students with disabilities.
The very groups that the Department of Education was designed to help.
Exactly.
And Global News, the New York Times, and the South China Morning Post all quote NAACP President Derek Johnson.
Okay, what did he say?
He called it a dark day for children who depend on federal funding for their education.
Wow.
It highlights just how much many vulnerable students rely on the department.
It does, and Democrats are also expressing serious concern.
What do they say?
The Guardian reports that they're worried about millions of low-income families who depend on federal funding for their local schools.
Okay.
They're saying that this could lead to larger class sizes,
Right.
teachers being laid off because of budget cuts,
Yeah.
reductions in special education services, and even college becoming much more expensive.
So access to education could be seriously impacted.
It could. And then there's the whole issue of student loans.
Right.
We're talking about a massive $1.6 trillion federal student loan portfolio.
Huge.
CNBC, Global News, El País, CNET Open, and Il Post, they all bring this up.
So what's going to happen to all those loans?
Well, the White House says that core functions like federal student loans and Pell Grants will continue.
Okay, so those will be fine.
Well, CNBC and the New York Times report that, but experts quoted in CNET and Il Post say there could be a lot of chaos and disruption if those programs are moved to the Treasury Department.
I see.
And then Global News mentions block granting as a possible outcome.
Block granting.
Yeah, where states get large chunks of federal money. But that raises questions about funding for programs like Title I, which is the biggest source of federal money for K-12 education.
Right, and Global News also talks about the concerns of families of children with disabilities.
Yeah, they're worried about losing federal protections and support.
And it's important to remember that federal funding only makes up about 10 to 15% of total K-12 budgets nationwide.
That's right, Global News, the New York Times, and Open all point that out.
But that money often goes to supplemental programs that help vulnerable students.
Exactly. Global News and CNET both emphasize that colleges and universities, though,
Yes.
they tend to rely more heavily on federal money for things like research grants and financial aid.
So they could be hit harder.
They could. And the New York Times and El País also point out that the Department of Education plays a big role in funding and disseminating education research,
Oh, right.
and they administer national standardized tests.
So what happens to all of that?
It's unclear. The New York Times says the future of these activities is uncertain given the staff and funding cuts.
And even if some programs are moved to other federal agencies,
Right.
Salon and the New York Times both wonder how effectively those agencies will be able to manage programs that are so specific to education.
It's a valid concern. And we can't forget that the executive order directly targets DEI initiatives.
Right. Diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Exactly. And what the administration calls gender ideology, Axios, El País, El Post, and The Guardian, they all highlight this.
It's a pretty clear sign that they want to change federal policy on these issues within education.
It is. So as you can see, this executive order is a big deal.
Yeah.
It could have major consequences.
But it's not the final word.
No.
The administration's definitely trying to downsize the Department of Education and shift its focus, especially when it comes to DEI.
Right.
But completely getting rid of the department that faces some serious roadblocks in Congress,
Absolutely, both legal and political.
the immediate impact will probably be felt most through staff cuts and a change in the department's priorities. But the long-term effects, those really depend on what happens in Congress and in the courts.
Exactly.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've looked at the specifics of the executive order,
Mm-hmm.
the motivations behind it,
Right.
the obstacles in its way.
And even some of the surprising aspects like past attempts to close the department and the uncertainty surrounding student loans.
This whole situation raises a really important question.
What's that?
Even if the Department of Education isn't completely abolished,
Right.
what happens if its role and its resources are significantly reduced?
Interesting question.
And what if more power is given to the states?
Mm-hmm.
Will we see more inequality in education across different states?
It's possible.
Or maybe we'll see some innovative new approaches.
Maybe.
And how will all of this impact students and families across the country?
It's something to think about.
This is a story that's still developing.
It is.
And it's going to be fascinating to see where it goes from here.
Fascinating. And maybe a little bit worrying.
Yeah, you could say that.